All right, welcome to the second half of Chapter 8, Overview of Photosynthesis. Here we're going to go through the photosystems, We're going to look at how photons of light energy are harvested, and then we're going to take the products of those reactions that harvest light energy and run them through something called the Calvin cycle to generate sugars. We'll briefly look at plants that are a little bit different than the ones we're focusing on today, and then we'll finish off by looking at how photosynthesis can play a role in climate change. Remember that photosynthesis occurs in two stages. There's the light-dependent reactions that need sunlight, and then there's the light-independent, or the Calvin cycle reactions, that don't use light. The light reactions in an overview are going to take the light energy from photons of solar energy. They're going to use it to make ATP and to reduce NADP plus to NADPH. And this is going to occur in the thylakoid membranes. The Calvin cycle is going to take that ATP and that NADPH that was formed in the light reactions, combine it with CO2 from the atmosphere, and then convert that CO2 into a different organic form, or into an organic form as glucose. It doesn't happen in one step, it actually happens in two. That's going to occur in the stroma, which is that thick fluid outside of the thylakoid membranes. So, discussion question: why is photosynthesis essential to most life on Earth? Take a moment, pause the video, think about it. All right, well, here's the thing. All organisms need organic molecules to survive. Photosynthetic organisms can make their own, but everything else requires autotrophs that are photosynthetic to get that carbon into the food chain, so that we can, heterotrophs like us can get our organic molecules, so we can build the proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, and nucleic acids that we need to survive. The light reactions are going to start photosynthesis, and the light reactions have what are called photosystems, and we'll look at photosystems in a second, and look at them in more detail. And then in between the two photosystems is an electron transport chain, and it functions very much like the electron transport chain that we saw in cellular respiration. We're gonna use the energy of the electrons to push protons across the membrane. They can only get back through that enzyme ATP synthase, same enzyme, and as it spins, it puts a phosphate on ADP to make ATP. Okay, and then there's another enzyme called NADP plus reductase, which is going to take those electrons when they come out of a second electron transport chain, add them to NADP plus, and then combine it with a proton to form NADPH. Those then can go to the Calvin cycle. So photosystem, what's a photosystem? Well, a photosystem is a series of light harvesting complexes, and within them are pigment molecules. And when the photons of light hit a pigment molecule, they excite electrons, and those electrons jump from one pigment molecule to another until they get to a special pair of chlorophyll A molecules that can then excite electrons that leave the chlorophyll molecule. Those electrons then go to a primary electron acceptor that's going to end up starting an electron transport chain. So we're shuttling this light energy through various pigment molecules until we get to that special pair of chlorophyll A molecules. Okay. Now we have to replace these electrons because they've left the chlorophyll, and we replace them by splitting a water molecule and taking two electrons from the water molecule and adding them back to the chlorophyll A molecules. The first photosystem is called photosystem 2, and you'd say, well, why isn't it photosystem 1? Well, because it was discovered second. The first photosystem actually photosystem 1 was discovered, and that's later on in the process. So in photosystem 2, we're going to excite two electrons, which are going to then be passed down an electron transport chain. We're going to replace those electrons by splitting water. When we split water, two electrons go to the chlorophyll. Two protons are lost into the thylakoid space, and then oxygen is going to be released as a waste product. Now, to generate ATP, we have an electron transport chain. And again, this is very similar to the electron transport chain that we saw in cellular respiration. Okay. From the stroma into the thylakoid space, the energy of electrons is going to push those protons into this thylakoid space. So this is the stroma, this is the thylakoid membrane, and this is the lumen of the thylakoid where the space is. And as these protons are pushed into here, they accumulate in number. They're pushing against each other because they have the same charge. And so the same kind of proton motive force that runs chemiosmosis is going to allow those to diffuse back through ATP synthase, get back to the stroma. In the process, the ATP synthase spins, and that spinning, the physical energy of the spinning, puts a phosphate on ADP to make ATP. Again, this is very similar to what we saw in the mitochondria. Once the electrons get through the first electron transport chain, they enter the second photosystem, photosystem 1. And light energy, again, excites pigment molecules that excite a special pair of chlorophyll A's that then push those electrons up into another short electron transport chain, okay, a second electron transport chain. And as those electrons are moving through, the energy fuels this enzyme, NADP plus reductase, to reduce NADP plus to NADPH plus H plus. So if we look at an overview of the light reactions happening in the thylakoid membranes, we're using light energy to generate ATP, NADPH. Both of these are made in the stroma, okay, but they're going to be used in the stroma in the Calvin cycle. And then when we split water, we replace the electrons on the chlorophyll molecules. We get protons to reduce the NADP plus to NADPH, and oxygen is released as a waste product. So another discussion question, how does photosystem 2 replace its electrons? Where does it get those electrons from? Give you a second to think about it. You can pause the video if you want. All right, the electrons in photosystem 2 are replaced by splitting water. Now, the Calvin cycle, sometimes called the dark reactions or the light-independent reactions, not because it has to happen in the dark, but because it doesn't use light. And what we're going to do is, it's a cycle, so you go around in a cycle, and each time you go around, we're going to kick off one of these G3Ps. Now, if you recall, in the middle of glycolysis, G3P was one of the intermediates that was formed when we split that 6-carbon molecule the first time. Well, we can go backwards. If we can make 2 G3Ps, we can put them together to build glucose, or enzymes can use that to make other organic compounds. So it starts, there's 3 phases to this. Carbon fixation, where we're taking the CO2 and we're converting it from a gas into a solid organic molecule. Then there's a reduction phase, where we're going to be adding protons and electrons to that organic molecules. And then there's a regeneration phase, where we have to rebuild the RUBP that we started with in order for a second cycle to occur. Oops, I went too far. Okay, so in the carbon fixation part, phase 1, this occurs in the stroma, and we're going to bring in 3 CO2s. And we're going to combine these with 3 5-carbon rubisco bisphosphate, RUBPs. Okay, 3 times 5 is 15. 3 times 1 is 3. 15 plus 3 is 18 carbons. We're going to then, enzymes are going to reorganize these into 6 3-carbon molecules of 3-PGA. 6 times 3 is 18. Okay, so what we've done is we're bringing the CO2 in. In the second phase, reduction, we're going to use energy from ATP that we generate in the light reactions, and we're going to harvest protons and electrons from our NADPH, and we're going to reorganize this 3-carbon 3-PGA into a different 3-carbon molecule, the G3P, that we're going to need. So 6 of these become 6 of these. And these inputs, the ATP and the NADPH, came from the light reactions. The ADP plus P and the NADP plus will go back to the light reactions, where they'll be recycled to make more ATP and more NADPH. Now, one of the G3Ps is released, And the other 5 times 3 is 15. We're going to reorganize these into 3 5-carbon RUBPs. But to do that, we need some energy. And so we're going to invest 3 more molecules of ATP to do that. And once this occurs, then we've completed our Calvin cycle. And as we go around again, each time we go around, we kick off a G3P. And we can use these G3Ps, 2 of them to build glucose, or more than 2 to build other molecules that the cell may need. So if we look at an overview of photosynthesis, ATP and NADPH from the light reactions are going to combine with CO2 in the Calvin cycle, and that's where we're going to make the sugars. Oxygen is being released as a waste product. Now, most plants are called C3 plants because the first product of their carbon fixation is that G3P, which is the process we just went through. Most plants utilize that form of the Calvin cycle in order to generate sugars. 95% of plants are C3. The problem with this is on really hot days. On really hot days, the plants are going to close their stomata. Remember those pores on the bottom of the leaves? And if you close the stomata to keep water from evaporating, then oxygen can build up. That waste oxygen we're producing can build up in the mesophyll of the plant leaf. And then what happens is instead of CO2 being used in the Calvin cycle, the rubisco can use oxygen instead. And what this is called photorespiration, and what it does is it very much reduces the amount of sugars we can make from photosynthesis. And so on really hot days, plants that are C3 plants don't do very well. They're going to shrivel up and wilt, and in a prolonged drought are probably going to die. And of course, if you mow your lawn, you kind of count on this about early July, is too many hot days and the grass dying, so you don't have to mow it every week. But there are plants that can fix their carbon in a different way. One is the C4 pathway. In the C4 pathway, we're going to have 2 different types of cells, where first the carbon dioxide is going to be turned into a 4-carbon compound, and then that can release at a CO2 again in a different cell to go through the carbon cycle. Corn and crabgrass are C4 plants. And these C4 plants, they thrive, well, I don't want to say they thrive, but they do better in hot, dry conditions than other plants. That's why when it's really hot and dry, the crabgrass is still growing in your lawn in clumps here and there when the rest of the grass has died. This is why corn is such an important grain crop, because if we have a prolonged dry spell, it's not going to impact the corn as much as it would soybeans or other produce, other crops. Cam plants are even better at saving water. These are going to be your succulents, your cacti that grow in really hot, arid conditions. What they do is they only open their stomata at night. Okay, so they can only fix carbon at night. Again, they turn it first into a 4-carbon compound, then release it as CO2 to go through the Calvin cycle. But these are organisms that have evolved to really minimize their water loss. So what happens to the products of photosynthesis? Well, about half of the carbohydrates that are made in photosynthesis are used by the plant or by the cells that make the carbohydrates, because they have to go through cellular respiration too, because they need ATP to fuel other cellular processes, and they don't get it from photosynthesis. So they make their carbohydrates, about half of them they burn in their mitochondria. They also use the sugars as a raw material to build all the other organic molecules, proteins, lipids, starches like cellulose in the plant. And then excess carbohydrates, many times plants are going to stockpile that as starch in roots or tubers, where it can be drawn from later or in the next growing season to bud out in the spring, or to put it in fruits that are going to, or put it in fruits that are going to surround seeds to make the fruit desirable to an animal to eat. And in the process of eating the fruit, the animal eats the seeds and then walks away and can drop the seeds well away from the parent plant, or in the seeds themselves, because when the plant embryo begins to germinate and grow, it's going to need energy to grow for a while until it finally develops the tissues it needs to photosynthesize by itself. And that extra energy is stored in the seed. Now, you probably heard about the greenhouse effect, the idea that energy from sunlight, solar radiation, penetrates our atmosphere and warms the Earth. But then, a good bit of that heat energy is going to radiate away, second law of thermodynamics, right, back into space. But the problem is we have an atmosphere that captures some of that radiant heat energy, and will keep it in the atmosphere. So not all of it escapes away. And the more greenhouse gases we develop, CO2, water vapor, methane are the big three, more of this energy is trapped. And so it's kind of like a greenhouse. If you've ever been in a greenhouse on a hot sunny day, it's very much warmer inside the greenhouse than it is outside, because sunlight can penetrate the glass panels or whatever they're made of in a greenhouse and be used and absorbed, but it can't all radiate back because it becomes infrared heat energy, and so it traps that excess heat. And the same thing is happening on the Earth. It happens naturally. We don't lose all that energy from the sun that hits the Earth and goes away. That's kind of good, because it kind of regulates the Earth's temperature to make it ambient, so you don't have really, really hot during the day and really, really cold at night, like occurs on planets that do not have an atmosphere. The problem is when we're releasing too much CO2 and we get higher and higher concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere, less and less of this radiant heat energy can escape. And what that's the theory is, what's happening is that's what's causing the ambient temperature of the Earth to increase. And that's global warming caused by the greenhouse effect. The main three greenhouse gases, water vapor is the big one, but that's going to stay pretty constant because the amount of water on the Earth is pretty constant. Methane, which is produced by methanogens in swampy areas or in the rumen of animals like cows and sheep that generate methane, and then carbon dioxide. Now, carbon dioxide has increased over the last 100 years or so, largely because of all the fossil fuels that were trapped in the Earth's crust that we're now using and burning for energy, whether it's heating and cooling buildings, whether it's making food, whether it's transportation, generating electricity, or in industry. And so as we've become more industrialized, as our population has increased, as more and more of the world wants to have electric appliances and wants cars to travel around in, we're generating more and more carbon dioxide. These two things are probably fairly constant, but the carbon dioxide is increasing. Now, if the world gets too warm, then there's a lot of things that can happen. First, we melt polar ice, that raises sea levels, and that can very much change weather patterns. And to a point, we're seeing that. We're seeing more severe instances of weather than what we've seen traditionally. Now, granted, there are times when you saw some of these same extreme weather patterns before, but we're seeing more of it. We're seeing more droughts, more wildfires. This is going to increase extinction rates. If you have organisms that require a certain amount of polar ice or a certain level of the sea or a certain type of weather pattern, then they may not be able to thrive in that environment anymore. And there are a lot of diseases, especially of humans, that are considered tropical diseases because the organisms that spread the disease can only live in areas where it's warmer. But as we have a 1 or 2 or 3 degree temperature change, now these vectors that transmit the disease, the mosquitoes and the flying insects, biting insects, now they can move farther north. And so we expect to see an increase of diseases too. Now, how can photosynthesis moderate that? Well, photosynthesis uses CO2 as a raw material. And so if we have more CO2 in the atmosphere, and we plant more trees, we allow organisms that are photosynthetic to survive for more than 1 year, as a tree grows, it's pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere and it's storing it in its tissues. And so it's becoming a CO2 sink, so to say, where the CO2 now is being pulled out of the cycle, and we would like to see reduced CO2. But this is going to take a while to occur. We're going to we need forest products. And as there's more and more people, we need more and more paper, we need more and more wood, We need the things that we can make from trees. And so it's going to be important. And of course, the most forest managers have been doing this for a long time, where they either selective cut so that they don't completely denude a forest, or they do an intense planting after harvesting to so that the forest regenerates itself more quickly. We can reduce fossil fuel consumption. All right, let's quit burning oil. Let's quit burning natural gas. Let's quit using coal, or slow down. You know, the reality is we're not going to be able to quit tomorrow. We've got, you know, think of all the devices that run on gas or run on propane. The amount of electricity we need until we find a better way to harvest it. Coal's kind of a cheap, easy way to get it. But over time, if we make small changes, we can reduce how much fossil fuel we're consuming, and that means we're going to put less CO2 as a waste gas into the atmosphere. And then finally, we can grow biofuel crops. Instead of using coal, let's plant something like hemp that can draw a lot of CO2 out of the atmosphere, and then we can harvest the hemp and use it as a raw material. So instead of bringing CO2 from the depths of the earth and putting it back in the cycle, we're using CO2 that's already in the cycle. And these are things that are slowly happening. We're not going to change everything overnight. It's going to take several generations before we're more efficient in how we regulate our carbon usage. And so that's the end of Chapter 8, Part 1. Here are the key terms you want to focus on for the exam. And these are the key concepts that you should use to test yourself on your knowledge of this material.